Hello, this is Lisa Taylor of Beyond Betrayal Community, and you're listening to episode 2 of our Spiritual Crisis videocast series. Today's session is being recorded live from New Zealand on September 22nd, 2015. My friends in North America, that's September 21st. To give you a bit of background on our Spiritual Crisis series, it began as a joint survey conducted by Beyond Betrayal Community and the Circle of Joy Ministries back in June this year. We had over 100 women respond, sharing their stories, both of spiritual crisis and spiritual growth. We gained some very valuable information from that survey. For example, 68% of the respondents said they experienced a spiritual crisis upon discovery of their husband's betrayal. The crisis tended to involve either negative feelings toward God, negative feelings toward the church and other Christians, or both. In our first videocast episode, I interviewed Amanda from Queensland, Australia, about her journey through spiritual crisis, including having to deal with a husband who spiritualized, Christians who told her she was the problem in the relationship, and her feelings of anger toward God. You can see that video on the Beyond Betrayal YouTube channel or at the Beyond Betrayal website under Spiritual Crisis Part 2. Today, I'm thrilled to be interviewing my compatriot, Coach Katherine of Journey to Healing and Joy, an absolutely awesome ministry for wives of sex addicts. I invited Katherine to join me today because our survey attracted many respondents who are or were in ministry or who are the wife or the ex-wife of someone in ministry. It became clear pretty quickly that these women were on a journey fairly different from mine, but I know Katherine's background as a pastor's wife who experienced enormous losses because of her husband's addiction. Katherine could very much relate to these women. Moreover, I knew that her story could encourage many because she's come out the other side and is now helping women who are working through a spiritual crisis. So welcome, Katherine.
Thank you, Lisa. What an honor to be here.
Well, it's an honor to have you. Katherine, you've shared a lot of your story in the Spiritual Crisis podcast series, posted at the Circle of Joy website and posted on the Beyond Betrayal website too. But for those who haven't listened to that series yet, could you outline a bit about how you discovered your husband's addiction and the spiritual crisis you faced, at that point?
Thank you. Sure. I'll try to make it concise. I've been married for 34 years, and both of us were Christians. And I was very young when I got married. I was 18. My husband was, or is, 7 years older. And I actually found out after we were married, about 3 months into our marriage, that he confessed that he struggled with pornography. And so we struggled through that, and he really, really desired, he really did, to overcome this. And so we decided that every Friday night we would talk about it. And so we did for about 15 years, and we had 4 children along the way, and Friday nights was our, confess time. And all I would ask is, how was your week? And that was his cue to be really honest. And honestly, I don't think we ever went through a week where he had said, it was a great week. I knew wasn't tempted. So it was really hard. So from the very beginning of our marriage, I really felt like I wasn't a priority, right? I really felt it. But my husband was honest. And so I had hope for that. And of course, now you're going back 30 some odd years ago, so it's a very taboo subject. And certainly in the denomination we were, it was very conservative. So it isn't like I had a pastor I could talk to or other women, right, that we could talk to. And but during those years, progressed in the church, and he became a deacon. And then at about year 15, something changed. And he became pretty distant, and he went through a period of time of telling me that he had been healed. And I wanted so much to believe him, and I did. I felt like our love had won out, and I think that's a desire of every woman, right? That our husbands finally come to a place where they realize the pain that they've done to us, and they don't want to do it anymore. Love wins out. And unfortunately, that wasn't the case. There was some real intimacy issues during that time, but he always had a really good reason as to why he wasn't interested. And at that time, we had we weren't even discussing intimacy anorexia. And so I just figured my husband was older. He was getting tired because he was a bivocational pastor at that time. And we were busy. And I chose to believe, spiritualizing in some ways, as a pastor's wife, that that's okay because I really love our life. So if that meant no sexual relationship, then that's okay because there's so much more to marriage than that in my head. And that went on for about 8 years. So I lived a pretty celibate life for 8 years.
Wow.
And then it's interesting. I don't think I've ever shared this part of my story. About a few months before it all imploded, my marriage fell apart. I was traveling on a business trip, which he did a lot for his job, and I remember just going back then. It was MSN. I don't know if anybody remembers MSN, but it was live chat. It was a live chat, and anyway. So I think he was in Korea, and for some reason, now I know it was God. I started chatting with him, and I basically asked him this question. I said, sweetie, um, something's not right. And I don't know what it is, but it feels like there's a woman between us. And I'm typing this to him, and I'm reading it. I'm thinking, where is this coming from? I had no clue whatsoever. And there was this long pause. And I remember as he, didn't respond right away, I'm thinking, I wonder what this means. And then he, once again, had this perfect explanation. And then literally months later, he was arrested. And during those 8 years, because for all of us that know about pornography, it's very progressive. And my husband went from pornography to affairs. One lasted for about a year and a half, and he fell in love with her. And she moved from a big city to where we were, unbeknownst to me. Then it became one-nighters. Then it became homosexuality, and then the downloading of child pornography. And that's why he was arrested, because his work discovered the child pornography on his laptop. And so on his way home from a trip, he was arrested at a public airport. And that's how I found out. Because for those 8 years, I chose, and I have to say that, I chose to believe my husband. I wanted so much to believe that his love for me conquered all. And so, of course, when the police came, and there was about 6 of them, the only thought that went through my mind at that time was, why is there 6 policemen telling me that my husband had died on the way? Because that's what I thought. He had gone missing for 24 hours after the arrest. And I actually thought that they were here to tell me that he had died on the way home the night before. And so I was so not aware what that night was going to bring. And I remember for the first, as they were entering into my home, and it was a rainy night, so they, mud all over the place, walking through all of the rooms, confiscating all the computers, right? I sat in my kitchen with the 2 officers. One was a male and the other one was a female. Still remember his name. And I would say the first half hour, 45 minutes, they treated me very harshly. They were actually quite cruel. And I think as they were sharing with me, I started to go into incredible shock. My body was shaking. And I remember having to tell them a few times, okay, I need you to stop. And then I would stand up and I would just pace. And I just remember praying to God, Lord, you got to do something right now, because I need to wake up. I need to wake up from this nightmare. Whatever has happened to me, you've got to wake me up. And then I'd sit down again and they'd share more. And I think as time progressed, they just realized that I did not know anything. And that was really how I found out about my husband's the depth of his addiction. And then from that moment on, of course, the ramifications of it, our church had to know. He was supposed to speak that weekend, which would have been just a few days later. And so I had to call our assistant up to the house. And he was, of course, in shock. And I remember there I am trying to be the professional pastor's wife and sharing what had just literally happened an hour before, with my house still a mess, my two boys in total shock, and knowing I had to tell my two older kids who weren't living at the house at the time. And I remember the poor pastor kept saying, "How could your husband do this to me? I'm retired. I don't want to take over the church." And I remember probably for the first time feeling so angry that I was feeling very invisible, that this was about him. And I think it was a good lesson for me because in the 11 years I've been walking this, I hear this a lot, that we as wives can go through such trauma, but it's not about us. It's about our husbands. It's about what others are feeling. And we become the invisible, you know, person who is carrying the burden of keeping the family together and trying to minimize the consequences of everybody, especially those of us in ministry, protecting the church. And I remember getting up that day at church, and I had to beg to say anything because the assistant pastor had talked to our head, bishop in our denomination, and he had a legal. They had talked to their lawyers, and they had to basically read this legal document to our congregation. And I just told them, and it was, of course, Easter time. Of course, timing, right? Easter. So, my husband was arrested April Fool's Day, 11 years ago, which really felt like an April Fool's joke. And I'm standing before my church at Easter and just sharing with them I couldn't say anything because I was not allowed to, but just sharing to everybody that, the enemy has a way of taking our eyes of what is important, and this is Easter, and remember what Jesus has done for all of us, and no matter what you hear, remember that Jesus is still in control. And there I am trying to compose myself, be the pastor's wife, my last responsibility to my church, and just remind everybody, this is about Jesus, and Jesus will get us through this. And then that was the day after I shared all of that. Another pastor from another denomination took me out of the church and then told me that it had become public. It was now in the newspaper. It was on the radio. And I think that was the first time, which was now a couple days after I found out, that was the time when it was on the media that I actually allowed myself to grieve, to cry. I actually collapsed in this pastor's arms. I just literally collapsed, realizing that I couldn't protect my children anymore. I couldn't protect my church anymore. I couldn't protect me anymore. That, it was just everywhere. And I was just so not equipped to share it with even my friends yet. And that was the beginning of my walk. And ironically, a few days later, I was called back to my assistant pastor's home, and they both asked me to not come to church anymore because the church loved me and they needed to establish themselves as leaders. And so now I didn't just lose my marriage as I knew it. I wasn't sure if my kids were going to survive this, honestly. And I didn't even know if my job working at a public school, right, was I was going to have a job. And so forget about finances. And then I didn't even now have my own spiritual family. I had no support. And we had to move because we couldn't afford our home anymore because my husband lost his job and he was in prison. And anyways, it was just a very, very lonely journey that I went through. And the good part of all of this was it made me so depend on Jesus. Even though I went through a crisis, and I did go through a crisis, I went through a huge crisis, very unbeknownst to a lot of people because I still had to appear strong somehow. I still had to believe that, if God had allowed this to happen, he knew I was going to be strong. It's amazing the things we go through in our heads. But that was really the beginning of this crazy journey.
You have one of the most powerful stories, Catherine. I look at you and I think, God, how does a human being survive that kind of I mean, it didn't completely hit you out of the blue, but it mostly hit you out of the blue. I mean,
But,
you had a
yeah,
sense something was wrong, but you couldn't begin to grasp the magnitude of what you were about to go through. You were so blindsided.
yeah,
And
and I think a lot of women are very much that way, though. There's hints of that in their marriage. At least the women that I end up coaching, I would say probably the vast majority of women actually kind of know something. Um, but there comes a time when all of a sudden it just explodes, right? And they have to come face to face with it. So, yeah, I really do believe that God had a plan, and I had to go through it all to get to the other side, including our topic of crisis of faith. I had to experience that.
yeah, absolutely. And you experienced it from all the angles because you had the feelings towards God of being let down. You had the feelings of your church very much letting you down.
Yeah.
You lost your faith community in
Yes.
which was, I think, as a wife of a pastor, I'm sensing it's not just your community like it is for most of us. It's it's your world. It's integrated
Yeah.
into your world so much more deeply than it is for those of us who are just Sunday goers. Um, so you
Yeah.
lost it all overnight, or within a week, and there you were. Oh, Catherine, your story is just so huge, and yet we can just thank God for what He has brought you through. That you are such a testimony because you are still here with us, and you're still fighting, and you're using it to help other women, which obviously was God's plan for you from the beginning. He wanted to
Yeah.
redeem this for you. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually say it's less of my testimony because my testimony would have simply been, Lisa, I would have left my marriage. Because that definitely was we react one of two ways, right? We either we run or we stay and fight, and I run. I was so not equipped to deal with this. So that would have been my testimony. Catherine's testimony is she left. I would have
Right.
just bundled up my kids like mother hen, mama bear, and I would have left. And I don't know what would have happened, but that would have been where my heart would have gone. So I tend to say, you know what, this isn't really my testimony. It's really God's testimony, because we really don't have the strength. We really don't have the courage. All of us, right, Lisa? We don't
Oh,
have it in us to
no.
face this. And so, I give it back to God, including my anger. I give it all to Him, right? Because it really is what He did through all of our stories, right?
Yes.
The good, the bad, the ugly. And, it's all about God doing His part, and that's the redemptive part, right? I'm through it, and so now I can talk about it, that's the redemptive part. That's God's stuff, right? That's God's testimony.
Yeah.
So yeah,
That's his
yeah,
specialty, redemption.
mm,
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely,
amen.
absolutely. And if there is anybody that's listening today or listens to this later that you haven't given God a lot of thought, but you are going through this with your husband, um, I really don't know of a way to get through this without the God who loves you. So
I
I
know.
pray that you'd maybe start just, and if you're just angry at him, just throw that out there to him. Just tell him, I'm
Yes,
angry. Shake your fist. But start a dialogue. Start a dialogue with him and see where it goes. Because I think you'll find that if you're open to listening, he
yeah,
wants to tell you that you are that he considers you to be his beloved. He wants to be yours.
yeah. Oh, for
So
sure.
yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna dig into some of our questions now. Now,
Okay.
as a coach of partners of sex addicts, you see women struggling with their faith, or sorry, do you see women struggling with their faith as a result of discovering their husband's betrayal? You think this is fairly common?
Yeah, actually, it's very common. And, not that every single woman wants to talk about it or is even aware of it. I think, especially now that you started with a survey, I'm noticing that we're talking about it more in our support group. So thank you, Lisa. And I knew that I wasn't an exception to the rule because you don't go through trauma and the very person that you have given your everything to, right, your husband, the trust is so broken, it ripples into every relationship, including God's, right? And I loved what you said to the women because it's so true. um, if I can just share that in the first, oh my gosh, probably the first 4 or 5 years, we ended up living in a mobile home, which was all we could afford, and on a Catholic retreat center, which is interesting, not being Catholic. So bless the Catholics; they have such a good heart. And so there was woods, which usually was very scary for me. But I would go in the woods and I would so yell at God. The words that would come out of my mouth were not pretty, especially for a pastor's wife. Not pretty at all. But you know what? Nobody was there. It was just God and me, and God knew how I was feeling. He knew. And I had a lot of anger issues. And to be perfectly honest, and again, it is who God created me to be, but I mourned. I'm not sure what I mourned more, Lisa, the loss of my ministry. And to me, my ministry was stolen from me because of my husband's addiction. So I had a lot of anger with the fact that I so invested years and years and years into my church, gone, right? Gone. Not because of what I did. And that was my heart. I am, a caregiver at heart. So I love being a pastor's wife. To me, that has always been the ultimate job, right? The most important job out there is saving lives, right? And bringing and participating in the healing of men and women. And so, my husband used to say, Catherine, you're the one with the pastor's heart. And it's true. So I mourn that. And in my defiance to God during my spiritual crisis, I took my cross off and I held it in front of God. I said, see, I'm this angry with you. I had taken it off, and I kept it off for quite a while. I cursed him. Oh, it's actually, I'm very embarrassed to say that. But I was so hurting because honestly, I was one of those goody two shoes. Again, I'm very embarrassed to share this. My kids have teased me by saying, nobody lives the kind of life that you've lived, Mom, because I had such a love for God since I was 4 years old that I, you know, lived a pretty straight life. And when everything was taken away from me, I asked those questions, right? Where were you? Where were you through all of this? Why did you allow this to happen? And that is the one thing that I keep hearing from women over and over and over again is, Lord, why? Why did you let me marry him, right? We had marriage counseling. We did everything right. Why did you allow this to happen? Why me? I've always been obedient to you, right? And this has been a lot of what women are sharing with me. The anger that they have towards God, because God could have prevented this, could have stopped it, could have brought their husband's addiction out in the open a lot earlier. And so there's this anger towards God. God, you are who you are. You created everything. Where were you in this? And so the feeling of being rejected and abandoned by God is so prevalent. And so a lot of women have found it very difficult to continue going to church, especially when their husbands, still acting out, are still serving in the very church. And the pastors know what they're saying, right, about their husbands, and the pastors are saying, but he's saying he's clean, and I choose to believe him. So this also affects this crisis of faith, right, when even the pastors don't believe them. So you've got God who allowed this to happen, and then pastors that aren't there to be supportive, to find out what's really happening behind closed doors. So yeah, a lot of trust broken. And when you don't have God to trust, and you don't have the church that's there to support you, that's a real crisis. That's a real crisis. Where do you go then?
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely. I've thought that our number of 68% that we got for the survey was actually, I thought that was a little low. And you could
I'm
see in some of the questions, because Catherine was very much involved in the survey right from the get-go, so she's read all the responses as well. And you could see some of the women processing, couldn't you, as they were answering questions.
Oh,
And
yeah.
one woman finally got to the very last question. She said, I know I said no, that I hadn't experienced a spiritual crisis, but I'm realizing now that the answer is yes. It took to the
Oh,
last
yeah.
question.
Oh, yeah. I think too, part of the issue that we have with crisis of faith, and I have the struggles to even get this group going has been amazing. So I know we're on the right track, Lisa. I know the enemy does not want this to happen. But there is this internal denial too. How can we have a crisis of faith? Right? We've known God all of our life. With me, I said, but God didn't do this to me. My husband did, right? So we go through this denial that we're actually going through a crisis until we start talking about it in the group. And, initially they're denying it. No, I'm okay. And then as we continue talking about it, you start to hear the anger coming out, the where was he? And all of a sudden there's, okay, I have an issue, don't I? Yeah, but it's perfectly normal. How can you go through trauma without, not having a crisis of faith? And just like the reverse, how can you really heal and not heal from the crisis of faith? That's why I think this is so important, Lisa, and I know that you agree, right? We need to come face to face with this truth. If we're having, a crisis, we've got to look at it. We've got to talk about it. We've got to provide a safe environment to talk about. We need to be honest about ours so that women can say, you know what? Okay, it's not a bad thing then, is it? I'm not a bad Christian because I'm having a crisis, right? And I think we need to talk about it and realize, it's all part of the trauma.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks so much for watching episode 1 of the Beyond Betrayal videocast with Coach Katherine of A Circle of Joy. Next week, Katherine and I will conclude our conversation about the spiritual crisis wives of sex addicts go through. I hope you'll join us then, either on YouTube or at the Beyond Betrayal blog, www.beyondbetrayal.community. Until next week, this is Lisa Taylor, wishing you all the best in your healing journey.